All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to Survey Magazine's webinar series. The title of today's webinar is Becoming Data-Driven, Planning for Success. Today's event is sponsored by Teradata. My name is John Lehman, and I'll be your moderator for the day. We have a great international audience today, and before I get started, I wanted just to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. Throughout our presentation, we encourage you to interact with our speakers by typing questions and comments using the questions pane on the right side of your screen. We'll be collecting your questions and comments during the presentation and then conducting a question and answer period after today's presentation. If you'd like to join the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag is #SurveyWebinar. The Twitter handle for today's guest is @Teradata. We'd love to have you connect with us online and keep the conversation going even beyond today's event. Also, for your information, we're going to make our presentation available to you, and we're also recording today's event, and we'll make that link available to you within a 48-hour period after today's presentation. Also, before I get started, I just want to also mention that our speakers today have authored a fantastic white paper with the same title. It's entitled Becoming Data-Driven. It's a great read. There's a lot of detail there that I think will be very interesting for our listeners. And so please, you can download that white paper at surveymagazine.org/Teradata. So I'll encourage you to do that as well. So now on to today's speakers. Tom Davenport is President's Distinguished Professor of IT and Management at Babson College. He is also co-founder of the International Institute for Analytics, a fellow at the MIT Center for Digital Business, and a senior advisor at Deloitte Analytics. He teaches analytics and big data in executive programs at Babson, Harvard Business School, MIT Sloan School, and Boston University. His most recent book is Big Data at Work, and this is also something that I would highly recommend. You can find that on Tom Davenport's website, and you can also, I think, access it through Amazon. So please look for that. The title is Big Data at Work. Bill Franks is the Chief Analytics Officer for Teradata and authors of books Taming the Big Data Title and Wave of the Analytics Revolution. Frank is a faculty member of the International Institute of Analytics and an active speaker who presented at dozens of events throughout the year. He's got a great blog. Analytics Matters addresses the transformation required to make analytics a core component of business decisions. So please also look at some of the books that Bill has authored. So I think it's a great honor to have both of you here with us today, and appreciate your time. So I'd like to try to perhaps frame our discussion a little bit today. We're going to have almost a kind of a panel discussion, and so I'm going to pose a question to you, Bill. I'm assuming that being data-driven can more than likely mean a lot of different things, and does it mean data-driven decision-making? Is it data-driven companies? Is it strategy, marketing, and so I think if we just got started by asking that very basic question, what does being data-driven mean?
Well, this is Tom. Why don't I start, and then I'll hand things over to you, Bill. And it's a pleasure to be working with Bill again. We've collaborated quite frequently, and good to have somebody who is actually a chief analytics officer to help us talk about these issues. You might argue that we live in a data-driven world these days. When I Googled the topic of data-driven, I found all of these different things, most of which I think are germane to our topic today. I'm not sure exactly what data-driven programming is, and we probably won't be talking much about that, but there are obviously a lot of different ways in which organizations can start to rely heavily on data as they make decisions and take actions. And certainly I think it's fair to say that the world is moving rapidly in this direction, and so Bill and I, working with Teradata at large, thought that it might be a useful thing to address the issue of what does it really mean to be data-driven. And our primary focus is on data-driven organizations, of course, companies and public sector organizations who want to become much more data-driven. And Bill, I'll let you define what we mean by that topic.
Yeah, and I think, Tom, as always, I always enjoy working with you on these things. And I think we've, as we talked about this, we came away really with the idea of what you see here. When you start to talk about being data-driven, it's really about companies driving, as it sounds, their decisions off of data. And more importantly, it's really the analytics. The data by itself isn't going to drive a decision. You have to build some sort of analysis on top of that data and some sort of process to leverage that analysis in order to actually make it happen. The key to that then is going to be that consistent data that you have throughout the organization, and that you're going to use it across not just the classic, customer-facing areas, but back in the operations. And I know when you and I have talked, one of the things I think that that companies need to understand is that this isn't like a binary thing where you are or you aren't data-driven. It's really a journey, and I think there's companies around the globe that you can point to that may be quite data-driven in one area of their business, but another area isn't as mature. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. It's an evolutionary process, but ideally organizations start to look to get every aspect of their company to be data-driven over time.
Yeah, note that we say most aspects of the company are driven through data and analytics. It doesn't mean that you can't still rely on your experience and your intuition at times, but it does suggest that instead of those being in the first resort as you're making decisions, that they should be the last resort. If you can't get any data, if you can't do any analysis, then fine, well, maybe you can rely purely on your experience. But in general, there's a whole lot of evidence suggesting that data and analytics-based decisions are more accurate, more precise, more rigorous than the ones that aren't, and so that's what we're advocating. The other thing I think it's important to point out is people all the time say, well, I'd love for my organization to be data-driven, but we have some data quality issues. And the fact is everybody has data quality issues. There is no organization in the world that has perfect data, and the larger you get as an organization, I think the less likely it is that you'll have perfect data. But data-driven organizations have made substantial progress in this regard. They govern their data. They have people who are responsible for different aspects of it, not just on the IT side, but on the business side. And it's good enough for widespread use. They don't encounter a huge number of problems as they go through their daily operations and apply data and analytics to decision making. And in fact, taking an analytics approach can actually ease quality problems to some degree because you can exclude outliers. It's a fairly common thing to do in various types of statistical analysis, and so you don't have to get every little piece of data right.
Gentlemen, I know you're fresh off, as I mentioned earlier, fresh off of authoring this white paper on the topic, and as I read through it, I see that you've outlined essentially four primary advantages of being data-driven. Can we, as we advance our presentation here, can you share some of these benefits and how you arrived at these four primary advantages, and perhaps share some examples of organizations that have truly realized the benefit of being data-driven?
Absolutely. Why don't we start with the benefits to customers, and of course, at least in capitalist societies, pleasing customers and understanding them and predicting their behavior and so on is something that organizations have to do if they're going to be successful. So the data-driven organization has a vast amount of customer insight. They gather and analyze data from almost every interaction that they have with a customer. Historically, there was a strong focus on customer demographics to lead to different types of segmentation. more recently, now that we increasingly have visibility into what customers buy, at least online or through our transaction systems, that's, what you bought in the past is probably the single best predictor of what you're going to buy in the future. So that's a pretty important type of information. And, we increasingly can even say, well, not only is it what you buy that matters, but are there things that you have considered buying, particularly online, that you haven't bought? And so if you considered buying it, we're going to harass you over and over again through retargeting until you actually buy it. I'm kidding to some degree, but only a little bit, because retargeting is a very important focus. I don't know, Bill, you had a much longer list of types of customer insight that organizations gather.
Yeah, well, I think the one thing today is that to really be data-driven, you have to view the collection and use of data more as a value exchange that's going to provide value both ways, rather than just a selfish thing to try and get your company more clicks or more sales. So it's really about having to meet some kind of customer need. And this becomes even more important, I think, with the privacy concerns that continue to rise to the forefront. People are starting to become more and more concerned with who has what data about them and how that data is used. And the fact is that moving forward, if you're not able to show some very clear and discernible benefit that a given customer will have by allowing you to have their data, then eventually they're just going to simply revoke permission to use that data. So it's I think, not just better for the customers, better for the organization. If everyone looks at it as the value exchange of really trying to use the data to further a relationship. And I think we all see too many examples where companies are mainly just using the data to send yet the 5th email of the day to their email database.
I think that's a very good point, Bill. And we can provide some examples of organizations that have taken that approach. One, I know we have some people attending from Europe, and certainly one of the leaders in the area of providing value to customers through a loyalty program was Tesco with their Club Card program. Tesco has stumbled a bit lately, but I think no one could dispute the fact that they became much more successful because of this loyalty program, and their focus, at least in their more successful days, was not just marketing, not just extracting more from an existing customer, but really rewarding customers for their level of loyalty thus far, both with targeted offers and also rebates as a percentage of what the customers had bought. In the same sense, Caesars, the world's largest gaming firm, gives away a massive amount of free or discounted goods to customers. I once talked to Gary Loveman, now the chairman of Caesars, and I said, reputedly you have a lot of information about your customers' behavior in their databases, including some things that maybe the customers wouldn't necessarily want them to know. Have you ever gotten any complaints? And Gary Loveman said, no, not a single complaint, and he attributed that to the fact that they give so much in response. It's that high level of value in exchange for the information. In the same sense, RBC, also known as Royal Bank of Canada, one of the earliest adopters of customer insights as a strategy in the Canadian banking environment, the first to have a customer data warehouse, the first to have an institutional customer data warehouse, the first to start to measure things like share of wallet in the Canadian market, the first to do activity-based costing to understand, which channel do we want to direct a particular customer to, and in that area of value exchange, the first to produce discounts not just on the basis of your own lifetime value with the bank, which they, again, were the first to assess, but even your relatives and close friends. You could get discounts on loans if your Aunt Minnie in Saskatchewan had a very high level of relationship with the bank and you didn't. So I think that idea of providing value in addition to gathering insights is a very, very critical one. Okay, let's move on to the next benefit. Bill, you want to describe it?
Yeah, and I think I referenced this earlier. A lot of people always focus on customer when speaking about being data-driven. I think because many times they're very personal, very easy to understand. But in fact, some of the biggest payouts can often be focusing on the back end of the business in terms of operational efficiency. When you look at things like supply chains and manufacturing processes, those have a huge impact on a company's costs. And to the extent that data is able to be collected and utilized to make them more efficient, it's possible to have some terrific gains. So I know we have a number of examples to go through here, Tom. I know to start out, you have one or two you love to talk about related to the service and sales processes.
Well, yeah, I think we overlook the service and sales processes in favor of, we think of operations as supply chain and manufacturing, but increasingly in sophisticated economies, more than half of the businesses are service-oriented industries. So looking very carefully at what are the factors that drive service performance, that drive customer success. And in retail, you have this idea of the service profit chain, which has revitalized a number of retail organizations when they start to measure customer satisfaction. How does that relate to employee satisfaction? How does it drive what customers actually buy? And you get this kind of positive cycle going of employees being happier, customers being happier and buying more as a result, so you can spend more on employees. So it all works out very nicely. So I think we all need to spend more of our time and effort measuring those service processes as well.
Yeah, I'll go through a couple examples here. I think one interesting one that's listed here is McCain Foods. And, McCain Foods isn't necessarily a household name, but I guarantee you that anybody listening here has come across McCain Foods products. They generate 1 out of 3 French fries globally. So if you eat French fries on any regular basis, I guarantee you've eaten the product from McCain Foods. And they went through a process as they grew their scope to the global scale. They ended up with so much data spread out, and they went through a large consolidation process. Their quote was they had 30,000 versions of the truth, and they got down to 1. And what they did, they really focused on some of their operational efficiency. And so they, among other things, have a metric called operational equipment efficiency, which they update every 15 minutes, which is looking at the most recent status of the throughput of their manufacturing lines. And not only does the CEO monitor this on a daily basis, but it's actually generated some competition among the various plants. So all of the workers are aware of what these measures are and how they're being utilized, and they really, they compete now to have the top scores on any given day or week or month. NCR is another example. They actually used to be the parent company of Teradata a number of years back. We still work closely with them. They handle 300 million transactions a day globally between the point of sale systems that you might come across in a retail environment, their ATM that they provide, kiosks at airports, things such as that. And what we've worked with them on in that scenario is predictive maintenance on their equipment. So if they're able to tell that the roller in the ATM is behaving funny, or there's too much heat, etc., they're starting to now proactively send technicians out to a piece of equipment when they're already in the area to prevent a complete breakdown that would take the equipment out of service. And they found that it saved quite a bit of money. Their ultimate goal is to have 0 unplanned downtime of any equipment anywhere. Obviously, it's going to be difficult to truly achieve that aggressive goal, but they have made great strides towards it, and you know, to the extent they can continue to get as close as possible to the ideal, I think they're going to continue to generate returns. One last
into the
example.
Internet and analytics of things, I guess there, huh?
Well, you do. And speaking of the Internet, I think the last two I wanted to mention are something you and I have talked about that's fascinating, is that some of the most successful companies today in terms of stock performance and market buzz don't even have inventory facilities. If you look at Uber or Airbnb, their entire value prop is in the fact that they collect, analyze data, and then push it back out. So, you know, in Uber's scenario, they know where you are, they know where drivers are, they connect you. They do analysis of traffic patterns to tell drivers where they might position themselves to have the best chance at the best rides. Airbnb simply connects people who want to rent or offer for rent property, and they do analysis, for example, that found that you know, good quality photos really cause a difference in close rates of a transaction, and so they started to make it easy and affordable for their property owners to get good quality photos and provide, they got arrangements for local photographers and all the big markets and so forth, because it's not only good for them because they get a cut of every transaction, but it helped people find a property and the people who wanted to rent a property. So those are some examples where it's all about operational efficiency and data, even in the absence of the traditional inventory or manufacturing facilities.
Yeah, they may not be worth quite as much today as they were a few days ago, but and they're probably glad that they're not public companies yet, I suspect.
Yeah.
But still very successful. And I think, you know, even outside of the for-profit company space, we can look at healthcare, for example, as an industry in which operational efficiency is really critical, and leaders increasingly are using data and analytics to assess how their operations are going. You know, one of the most successful healthcare organizations in the United States is the Cleveland Clinic, and not just in the United States, they're also in Dubai and places like that. But Toby Cosgrove, the CEO, is just fanatical about operational improvements. And as you suggested, Bill, about McCain Foods, they developed a new metric of what percentage of their patients could get appointments within 24 hours, and Toby Cosgrove thought people were having to wait far too long, and so they started to assess that, and you know, that's almost inevitably, once you start to measure it and publicize it, that metric starts to improve. So now you can get an appointment at Cleveland Clinic with a very high likelihood within 24 hours, and they realized, in the United States at least, they were the biggest blood user in the entire country, and so they started to assess much more carefully the use of blood, which is a really expensive resource. I suggested to them that maybe there were some vampires lurking in the back rooms there, but they denied that. So let's move on to the next benefit, which is probably the most traditional one, the one with which we're most familiar from information systems. It involves better financial management. That's kind of where IT started, but it's still going. And there are all sorts of things that organizations can do to optimize their finances and understand better what's happening in their financial performance environment. Certainly, in environments like the one we've experienced for the past few days, there's a strong focus on risk analysis and how exposed are we to various problems in the global economy. Increasingly now, organizations who spend their capital should have tested whether that investment is really going to pay off, and there are ways that we can use data and analytics to test, you know, should we spend money on the interiors of our branches or our stores or whatever, or the exteriors, for example. We can test all that. And you know, performance management has historically been a backward-looking activity, but increasingly we can get more predictive about it and understand the drivers of performance management so that we can address them before, you know, the damage is done.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting too, because I think this is one area where sometimes you don't have to get overly sophisticated to get a really good result. So I know one of the companies that we've talked about is Boeing. they have really put a focus on getting a very robust and up-to-date financial status and set of data available so that anyone across the organization can see the latest status of what's going on the books. And this is critical in a business where, even some of the component parts of the items that Boeing deals in can be massively expensive. And so that transparency of information and enabling people to see that current fiscal state is absolutely critical. And so, it may not be the sexiest of the analytics that we'll talk about, but having the self-service business intelligence functionalities in place that a company like Boeing does to really let people explore and understand the finances can drive some terrific benefits.
Yeah, you can't neglect the basics, and we'll be talking about that later. A couple of other examples. I'm a primary, advocate for Canadian banks today, but TD, also known as Toronto Dominion, quite sophisticated at measuring, this is kind of halfway between service operations and financial management. They wanted to understand just what are the financial implications of better service. So they did some pretty sophisticated analysis to understand across all of their branches how much financial performance did better service actually drive. It turns out they now know the answer. 19% of branch profitability is driven by variations in service, which sort of gives you an idea of how much it's worth investing in better service in a banking environment. The other example that I think is really changing an industry quite dramatically is the whole usage-based insurance area, which you see mostly in property and casualty insurance. Progressive, one of the early firms to adopt this approach of kind of measuring how much you drive, how fast you drive, when you drive, and so on. But now this has spread all around the world. In the UK, I think Aviva is one of the early adopters of this capability. In the US, we now have Allstate and State Farm offering it as well. I think it really can transform this industry. All these companies find that how you drive, perhaps not surprisingly, is the single best predictor of whether you're going to have an accident or not. And we're going to see much more of it. And now even in health insurance, we're starting to see it where John Hancock, for example, has a program that gives you discounts on your health insurance based on your activity tracker data, your Fitbit or your Garmin or whatever. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that in another sector as well of the insurance industry, and obviously it's a very data-driven domain. Let's go to the last benefit, Bill. I think you're going to take us through that one.
Yeah, this is something that's a relatively new trend, this idea of creating products and services based on the data and analytics. And most people think that this is more or less tied just to the sort of newfangled Silicon Valley online companies, and that's actually not true. What I think is most interesting is that with the technology becoming available, particularly when you start to talk about things like the Internet of Things, traditional industrial firms, some of the most old school manufacturing organizations are completely transforming themselves because they're going from really having, in some cases, very little data on how these large manufacturing lines were running to having incredibly detailed data and being able to provide information that's not just of value to them as they produce it, but if you look at what the auto companies are doing, putting various sensors and analytics within cars these days, they're also helping to enable these products to benefit customers. You also have a number of organizations starting this trend of forming new business units. So I know the telecommunications industry is one that has a couple examples of this, where there's been even vice president level positions whose sole purpose is to examine the data and the analytics possible on that data that the company has and develop products. So in the telecommunications case, they're sitting on treasure trove of, who was where at what point in time and what was the pattern of movement. And there's a lot of ways to aggregate and, protect the privacy of the individuals involved while still providing terrific insights to other organizations and third parties. So I know, Tom, you have a couple of very interesting examples of this trend as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're certainly seeing it in the agricultural space with companies like Monsanto, DuPont as well doing this, creating precision agriculture services using weather data and hybrid seed growth data and all sorts of data on soil conditions and so on, even down to the individual farmer field level to recommend when to plant, when to water, how much to water, how many seeds per cubic centimeter to plant, at what depth, when are you likely to need some pesticides and herbicides, and when should you harvest? And that seems like you're taking over a lot of the key decisions of a farmer, but they're happy to take those recommendations if they increase the yield of a farmer's crop by 10 to 15%. So these are services that farmers actually pay for. In the online space, the whole data product idea is a fairly well-established one. I think LinkedIn was one of the earliest adopters of this with people you may know. That was their first data product. They now have a variety of others, groups you may be interested in, jobs you may like, and so on. They attribute half of their membership to people you may know. So clearly a very successful data product, suggesting people you may want to network with. And you suggested there are new business units in telecom firms, but also at banks. Barclays in the UK has something called the information business. How do we take all this vast amount of information we have about our customers and provide some valuable products and services to them on the basis of it? Same at JP Morgan Chase in the U.S. So I think this will be one of the fastest growing domains of data-driven benefits that we'll see going forward.
Yeah, when you get into some of the large-scale industrial areas, GE sells some incredibly large and expensive items, things like wind turbines and aircraft engines, very expensive healthcare equipment. And what they've done is they've sort of made a component part of all of those traditionally large-scale industrial products also have a very large component of data-driven analytics. So this equipment self-monitors, self-adjusts. The wind turbines will adjust both the angle and even the shape of the blade. It will deform the shape of the blade to maximize the throughput of the energy. They self-monitor the performance, and predictive maintenance algorithms are spread throughout. So really, when you're buying these products, one of the big value-added components of them now is this idea of the data-driven analytics that come off of it to help not just GE do better business in terms of keeping the equipment running efficiently and meeting the the warranty goals and so forth, et cetera, but then of course the customers get the benefit of being able to monitor how that investment's performing for them. So it's really a terrific partnership.
It's kind of the NCR example you mentioned earlier. Some might fall into that category as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
John, you want to take us into the next set of questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. So that's I think a really good kind of overview of the benefits of financial management and some operational efficiencies and certainly some new product creation. But for our listening audience, I think that maybe the question might be is, where do I start? It's changing culture or structure in an organization and all of the dynamics that are in play with that. It's just typically not an easy task, and we're just curious to know, is it a paradigm shift for organization? Is there a process that you can recommend? Where do they get started?
Sure, we can certainly talk about some of the key questions that have to be addressed, or the key choices that have to be made. And I don't think there are necessarily right answers to any of these, but it is important that you have an answer. You can find some leading companies that have taken very different approaches. So, the first question I'd like to address is, should I focus on, Bill and I were just talking about these data products and embedding data and analytics into new products and services. Should that be my focus, or should I focus on internal decision making, which was, the historical focus of data and analytics primarily? And you have great examples of both. Bill mentioned GE, which I think they have, of course, some internally focused analytics, but their primary focus has clearly been on creating new products and services, whole new business units with GE software that are focused on the, what we can offer in terms of products and services to customers. You have other companies, last year, year before last, I wrote a case study about Procter & Gamble, a very successful company at internal use of analytics, but I don't know how much sense it would make to start offering data products when your primary businesses are, Tide and Olay and Pampers and so on. So you need to decide where you're going to get the most value. Another key question, Bill and I recently addressed this in a research study for the International Institute for Analytics, looking at chief analytics officers versus chief data officers and what are the differences. One of the key distinctions turned out to be chief analytics officers like Bill, a little more focused on offense. How do we get additional value for our business out of data and analytics, whereas more of the chief data officers were focused on defense, risks, security, avoiding data privacy breaches, et cetera. And both are important, but I think as an organization you need to decide what's your mix of these two goals and exactly who's responsible for each one.
Yeah, and another of these decisions is whether you start with infrastructure or business applications. And the reality is you can't get too far in front of either of these with the other. So if you don't have the infrastructure to support the collection and analysis of the data, you can't be building effective applications. At the same time, you can build a terrific infrastructure, and if you don't put any time into doing something with it, by building applications, you're not going to get the value. So it's really important to have some type of a balance, and sometimes you may make an explicit decision to go down a certain path. So I know one of the examples we had was Lloyd's, the large financial organization. They looked at what they needed to do and decided that in their scenario, their infrastructure was too far outdated to support some of their future needs. So they made a decision as a management team and as an organization to spend a couple of years doing some massive overhaul of the infrastructure, knowing that that would delay some of the new business applications they wanted. But on the back end of that infrastructure, then they were going to go in earnest after a variety of business applications. So they took a short-term pain to get the foundation in place and planned as they were in that process on how to move quickly when it was up. And that was a way to really help them move forward by not necessarily focusing on each equally on a continual basis, but giving one or the other priority as it made sense. And in their scenario, they launched a new digital business unit in 2013 based around that new infrastructure. When we talk about all of that, this idea of what type of data, and people often talk about the classic transactional data. That's still critically important. There's a lot of discussion now about what people often term behavioral data as we integrate data about customer service interactions or web browsing. We're now getting into Internet of Things, sensor data. There's a whole wide range of data. And I think the fact is, to be successful when it comes into being data-driven, you're going to have to actually capture all of these types of data, and you're going to have to harvest the best pieces out of each of them, and then also tie those pieces together. So, simply knowing certain facts about my driving patterns from a telematics device in a car is important, but you also need to know some things about my accident history or about my my age and income and so forth to effectively set rates. So I think that's one of the key things. To be data-driven, it's about all the data, all mixed together, all adding value jointly. It can't be siloed, as many companies made the mistake of doing in the past.
And by the way, note that we don't use the terms big data and small data. I think transactional and behavioral may be much more descriptive set of terms than those popular ones, or at least big data is a popular term. Small data never really took off as a term. Then there are, of course, the questions of what kinds of analytics do you really want to do? Most of the organizations Bill and I talk to are saying, well, we've done descriptive analytics for a long time. We need to really move into the more sophisticated types involving, prediction and prescription analytics that tell people at the front lines what to do in order to perform their jobs more effectively. I think there still may be some cases, healthcare may be a good example, where you have to master the basics of descriptive analytics first before you move into a lot of prediction and prescription. But that's a question I think a lot of organizations face. And then increasingly, there's the question of, am I doing this in order to help a human make a better decision? Will a human be evaluating the results, or do I just put that into an automated decision process of some type? Bill talks a lot about that in his new book, and I'm quite focused on this issue of, what is the human role in all of this automated decision making that's going on? I think we'll be seeing more and more of that, and organizations really need to ask themselves that question of how many smart humans are going to be involved, and how many smart machines going forward. John, you want to take us? I think this is our last topic of the webinar.
Sure, absolutely. And Bill, maybe this is a good question that we kind of start with you and try to get the Teradata perspective on this. And I'd like to refer back to your white paper again. As I kind of read through it, I came to kind of understand that there's almost a hierarchy or a level of achievement to becoming data-driven. And I guess the question would be, can you share what some of these steps might be, or what the various levels are? How did you arrive at them? Are these goals that an organization should try to set for themselves, or is it kind of a natural progression of becoming more data-driven?
Yeah, sure. So if you go to the next slide here, I think we'll introduce this, and then Tom and I will dive into each of the components. But effectively, there's really three stages that we've identified to becoming data-driven. And it's important to know that you're going to have to master all of these in order to be data-driven, and it's a progression. So you can't jump straight to the end without doing the early pieces, and you can expect that it's going to be more of a journey than a quick trip. And so the three labels we put on these are a foundational component, which then leads into some data-driven competencies, which will then lead into data-driven strategy and competition. And we'll dive into each of these. And Tom, I guess I'll let you sort of kick it off there.
Sure. So I think it's just important to, before we leave the overall set of stages, it's important to know sort of what you're after. It wouldn't make a terribly good answer. Well, Tom Davenport and Bill Frank said you need to move through these stages. You need a better reason for that. And what are you trying to accomplish as you move through these things? So the foundation stage, of course, typically needs to come first, and it's not terribly exciting, but you need to have things in place like, do I have decent transaction systems like ERP and CRM? If you don't know basically what's happening in your business and you can't get your debits and credits straight in your financial system and so on, well, that needs to be a priority. We have learned that typically you need some place to analyze that data that's separate from the transactional systems, so typically some sort of data warehouse or data mart, something Teradata has a lot of familiarity with. Some ability to do at least descriptive analytics and reports on that data, and then even at these early stages, some degree of governance to make sure that you can pull off some data integration and common data. So again, not exciting, but quite necessary for these later stages.
Yeah, I think that last comment you made is really the important one. It's this foundational situation does not make you data-driven, but it's impossible to be data-driven without it. So I remember from my college math course, my least favorite course, proofs, there was a term, necessary but not sufficient, meaning there would be certain conditions that had to be true in order to have your proof complete, but they weren't sufficient, meaning there was other criteria that also had to be true. And I think this foundation stage falls into that category.
So how do we get to the next stage, Bill?
So when you get into data-driven competencies, this is where I think many organizations are today, at least the organizations I know I deal with. This is where you're starting to actually have widespread use of both predictive and prescriptive analytics. Again, prescriptive analytics being those scenarios where we've embedded and automated the analytics and the actions that come out of those analytics. Typically, you're having the frontline workers, maybe a call center or an agent, whatever the case may be, actually getting recommendations or direction for their next actions and their, what they should say and do based on analytics. And typically, results are not just being tracked, but also forecasted and predicted as well. Typically, the culture has to evolve to where you must bring some data and some justification for your decision, and that just simply saying that you have a feeling that something's good will no longer be good enough. You're obviously going to have to embrace these different types of data that we talked about a little bit ago. You can't be sticking to your classic transactional and financial information. I think one of the most important components is, it's sort of cliched, but it is true. You're going to have executive support for this. And one thing I always say is you don't necessarily have to have full enthusiastic support from every executive, but they have to at least be committed to attempting to be data-driven and to giving the whole concept a chance. If they'll at least go that far in time, I'm confident that they'll see the results and they'll eventually become enthusiastic. But it's really critical to get that top-down support.
Yeah, no, I agree. You're not going to do this by stealth. And I think it's also important to point out that, when in these behavioral data initiatives or what we used to call big data, it's early stages. It's not typically in production mode in these data-driven competencies organizations. It's kind of exploratory pilots and very early stage projects. So then we get to the sort of ultimate level, which is the data-driven strategy and competition stage. And I don't know, I've never really counted the number, Bill, of organizations that are at this stage, but I'm guessing it's certainly, even among large organizations, it's no more than 5 or 10%. They tend to be the high performers in their industries, however. So what do? Well, they're getting into this space of new products and services based on data and analytics. They are doing predictive and prescriptive analytics on a broad scale, and in fact are embedding them within systems and processes, so some of the decisions become automated or even invisible, as Gartner had put it in their tech trends for analytics trends for 2015. They're using transactional, behavioral, structured, unstructured data. Many of these organizations are experimenting with new data architectures involving things like Hadoop, data discovery platforms, data lakes, and they have people who are leading the charge, typically chief data officers, chief analytics officers, who are making this happen. So I don't know, Bill, maybe as a chief analytics officer, you could say, is that an important component?
Yeah, you know what I always say too. Don't get hung up on the titles. It's really about having an executive role that owns these functions. So in some organizations, maybe it's a VP of analytics or a VP of data. But the point here is that what I always challenge the companies I deal with on is I say, look, if analytics and data is something core and strategic to your business moving forward, how can you possibly be optimally effective if there's nobody that actually has responsibility and owns that at a corporate level? So I think this is just the natural outgrowth of the rise in prominence of data and analytics. As it becomes more pervasive, as you're spending more and more resources on these activities, it to me is just natural that not only does the organization grow that's supporting that, but as that organization grows, you end up having to have a leadership function and a strategic function to support that.
Well, and we found in our study of CDOs and CAOs a lot of overlap and confusion about what roles are in what titles. So I think that's a very good point. So moving to our last slide, Bill, you want to talk about some of these companies to start with?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you think about it. There's a couple industries we've listed here that have been, I think, thought to be a little bit ahead in certain areas. So when you look at financial services, they've been pretty aggressive in pursuing analytics for many years. So in multiple aspects of their businesses. So some are very good at the customer aspect. Some are incredibly good at risk and managing the risk of their investments and the cash. And then of course a recent one that's becoming even more important than ever is fraud, and the sophistication and depth of both ends of it, both what fraudsters are able and willing to do in order to try and defraud financial institutions, but also the preventative measures that the financial institutions are taking. It's a pretty impressive arms race going on there, and similarly retailers have varied. Some are phenomenal at the customer experience, some are phenomenal at the operational or supply chain end of things, and in both of these industries, the leading organizations are attempting now to do what we talked about earlier, which is to also become more data-driven in parts of their businesses that weren't what initially drove them there.
Well, yeah, and I think if you looked at those same industries in Europe and Asia, you could find examples of quite progressive organizations who've achieved that level of data-driven strategy and competition. Certainly in financial services, you mentioned Lloyd's, Bill, Barclays focused on that level, I would say, for quite a while. HSBC, with very strong focus on fraud detection and so on, and some retailers as well, companies like Metro and so on. We mentioned Tesco earlier. The online space is mostly U.S. companies, but certainly Google is one of the most analytical companies on earth. eBay and LinkedIn, we mentioned earlier. Facebook, very much into all of this. A lot of infrastructural work that these companies have undertaken. Facebook now, I think, manages 25,000 servers with one person on average. The ratio of servers to people is 25,000 to 1. So that suggests if you're really into this in a serious way, you've got to invest some pretty serious effort into infrastructure. So with that, John, I know we wanted to see if we had a question or two that we could answer.
That's fantastic, gentlemen. This is a great presentation. I think it really lays some great groundwork and for companies to gear themselves up to being more data driven. So yeah, we do have a couple of questions, and as we kind of get started in the Q&A session here, if you have a question for Bill or Tom, please enter it into the right panel on your screen, and we'll try to address it. But so here's the first question. It kind of goes back to the culturally preparation of the topic. And so the first question is, what is the best way to go about building a business case and preparing culturally for an organization to become data-driven?
You want to take a cut at that one,
Yeah.
Bill? It's such an easy question, I'll give that one to you. So.
Yeah. Boy, we could probably do a whole webinar on that. I'd say one thing I always like to stress is it's like anything. This could be a very overwhelming proposition, especially if you feel like you're starting from well behind. So I know I stress, Tom stresses, the organization I work for, Teradata, likes to stress breaking it into some digestible chunks, right? You need to have the vision for the end game that you want to get to, but that's not what we have to completely plan for today at the start. Let's plan for what can we do in the next 1 to 2 quarters to get us down the right path, and what might we do on the quarter or two after that, and start to go after building out some of the foundational functionality, demonstrating the value that those are driving, and then moving to the next phase. And I think the most important part of that people can forget to do is that measurement. You've got to be measuring the impact of what you're doing, because that's what will help you continue the momentum in order to go on to the next phases. But you absolutely have to go through a variety of steps, and recognizing that can actually make it far less intimidating, and I think get support more quickly, because people will see they're not committing to a 5-year, $100 million effort. They're committing to a couple quarters of a much smaller effort that leads to a vision over a period of time as it evolves.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think our 3-stage model would suggest that you need at least 3 different business cases, but I think we'd go even further and say that even within them, you'd need to break it up and say each stage is going to consist of a series of infrastructural and applications and even human capability initiatives, and you probably want to think about each of those as having a business case rather than a big broad one, as Bill is suggesting.
Okay, great. And here's a question that actually kind of leads right off of where you left there. It's kind of a more of a practical step. And so the question is, which groups do you consider to be key stakeholders when moving an organization in this direction? How do you get started? Where do you get the early traction?
Well, it's interesting that when we were talking about this in terms of the chief analytics and data officers, the question came up of how important is it that IT organizations be leading the charge, and I think we had a slight difference of opinion in that I thought, in principle, it would be a really good thing to have IT overseeing both your offense and defense-oriented initiatives, since they do overlap and relate closely. Bill pointed out correctly, I think, that in many cases IT organizations are not really prepared to take a leadership role in both of these areas, and you shouldn't worry about it quite as much. But I'll just say it's really important to have IT on board, at least.
Yeah, and I think, the flip side of that, it comes down, you almost have to have everyone on board, right? Because in addition, obviously, there's going to be some core technology components of this whole process. So IT can't be ignored, but at the same time, it gets sort of back to that idea of the business applications versus infrastructure. Unless the business is on board, bringing some of the ideas of what they do differently and signing on to make use of that technology and that data once it's available, then it's sort of a wasted effort. So, I think for the most part, it's got to be an organizational-wide commitment.
Okay, perfect. So here's we still have room for one more question, so we'll take this question and then we'll probably have to wrap it up for the day. And so, how would you go about handling sensitive data or to ensure certain data is secured?
Well, another easy question, Bill. I'll just let you take that one. So.
Yeah. Yeah, we could do this is another webinar topic, honestly, but I think the key is just to be aware of it from the get-go, and to think carefully about who needs access to what data. Most people will do fine to see the aggregate results that have already effectively masked the sensitive information underneath. And in many cases, even those who need to deal in the detailed data may not need to know exactly the identifying information. So, for example, for me to look for a fraud pattern, I could be given just the activities of a given account, and that account number could be masked as an example. So I would have no way as the analyst to actually track it back. So there's a variety of ways to ensure and protect privacy, but that does have to be an explicit focus and a concerted effort made to keep that as a focus as you go, because it's too important to ignore.
Yeah, I would agree. Anonymize as early as possible, and make it as difficult as possible to reconstruct the identity of the person. If we're talking about customer data, clearly you need to devote a lot of time and energy to this issue, and it's a different world that we're living in now than we've lived in the past. All of these privacy breaches that we've seen, have been very serious for the companies involved. So one of the things you need to do is to make sure you have a role focused on these issues. Another is even, board level, senior management team level focus on them is necessary, I think, to make sure you don't run into too many problems.
Okay, well, gentlemen, again, I want to thank you very much for your time today. And as you saw there on the previous slide, I don't want to forget to remind you that this is a fantastic white paper, the presentation you've just seen, but you can download this white paper at surveymagazine.org. Look for the resources tab and follow the prompts to the Teradata webinar. There you can find both the recording and access to downloading this white paper. I strongly suggest it. It's a good read. I've been through it 3 or 4 times myself just because it's full of great stuff. So I'd also like to recommend that you grab both of our speakers' recent books. They're fantastic. I suggest that you seek both of those out. Also, I'd like to thank you for joining us. You'll be receiving an email here shortly that will alert you to the on-demand and the recording of today's event. So if you missed any material, we'll certainly be sure to get that back to you. On behalf of our guests, Tom Davenport and Bill Franks, as well as the entire Teradata team, my name is John Lehman, and we wish you a very good day. Thank you for attending.